Hello and welcome to this session on Unified Remote Access in Windows Server 2012. My name is Sharat Kailasam. I'm a program manager in Windows Networking. And today, we're going to be talking about the enhancements we've made in Windows Server 2012 for remote access and how we've brought together DirectAccess, VPN, and site-to-site in a comprehensive offering which will meet all the enterprise's remote access needs. So the agenda for today is we'll go through a quick introduction on unified remote access. We'll talk about the changing work landscape and how people work nowadays as opposed to maybe 10 years ago and how that's influenced our decisions in coming up with this unified offering. We'll talk about the building blocks which make up our remote access offering and delve into some of the technology areas where we made these improvements. And finally, we'll do a deep dive, including some very exciting demos on the integrated client experience, new features like multi-site and off-premise provisioning. We'll also talk about integrated management, deployment, and ongoing monitoring and reporting that we've included in the offering for Windows Server 2012. Some of you have probably seen this slide before. It's the pillars upon which our Windows Server 2012 OS is built, and there are 4 pillars, and one of those pillars is the modern work style. And remote access in Windows Server 2012 meshes right in with this modern work style in that we provide access to data regardless of where it resides and regardless of where that access is happening from. So we'll talk about that a little more as we get into the presentation. So firstly, let's take a step back and examine the changing work style that we've come to know over the last few years. The first thing I want to talk about is work-life blur. So let me give you an example of what I mean by work-life blur. This is where your work life and your personal life are constantly intertwined. And as we go forward, it's very difficult to see where those boundaries stop and where they start. So for instance, I live in Redmond, Washington, and every morning when I get up, one of the first things I do is check my email. I check my work email, right? And I do it I check it on my phone, I check it from my work laptop, I check it from the PC that I have at home. So I'm accessing this, I'm doing this work at a time when I would normally not be doing it, right when I get up, but I'm also doing it from a variety of devices. And similarly, when I come back home, the last thing I do before I go to bed is I check my email, finish up reports, and again, I'm at home, but I'm still doing work. And I'm doing work on personal devices as well as enterprise devices. And so as work style evolves, we expect to be able to work from anywhere. We expect to be able to have access to our data and our resources from anywhere. And this is getting more and more prevalent as the data that we're trying to access is no longer just in one location. It's in the on-premise data centers. It's in the cloud. And we want to be able to get to it regardless of where it's located. And we have an expectation that we want to be productive at all times, be it working from a coffee shop, be it working from an airport kiosk, or even on the airplane, right? When I was flying over here from the US, we had Wi-Fi on the airplane. So, hey, I was connected up, and I was actually doing work when I was on the airplane. So people's expectations of when they should work and when they do work has changed dramatically over the last few years. And now there is the expectation that you want to be able to do your work from anywhere. And that plays right into the concept of being always connected. So there are a couple of things I want you to take away from this slide. It is that where our data lives and how we access it is changing. Like I mentioned before, we have data living in the cloud, we have data living in on-premise data centers, and we're accessing that data from a variety of different devices, so that's changing. And also, how we work, when we work, and where we work from is also changing. We work from home, we work on the road, we work from coffee shops, we work from airport kiosks. We're always have this notion of needing to be able to work. And so while we were making our decisions for the unified remote access solution, these concepts were something which we kept in mind and drove our principles for the design of the product. So now let's talk about a range of alternatives for remote access. So you have, like I said before, there are a number of different devices that people use to do work. So let me get a show of hands on how many folks in the audience have done work since you arrived here at TechEd from a personal device, like a tablet, for instance? A significant number. Was it just email, or were you actually connected into your CorpNet and doing things like approving expense reports? Email? Line of business apps? Anybody? A few of you are. OK. So let me ask the reverse question as well. How many of you were doing personal work on your enterprise machines? Sending email to your spouse or whatever it may be. So yeah, so as you can see, there's a need to do both. Do your personal stuff as well as your enterprise work from a variety of machines. So up front, we've got Windows and non-Windows tablets, and we've got Windows and non-Windows PCs. And for that, we can use VPN as a mechanism to provide the access to the enterprise network on the right-hand side of your screen. We also have mobile phones from which you have, including some of our competitors, have VPN offerings which provide you access to the enterprise network. We then have managed Windows clients for which we have a premier offering, namely DirectAccess, which you can use to access your enterprise resources. And VPN is also obviously supported on managed Windows clients. And finally, from any PC, you can use technologies like VDI, Virtual Desktop Infrastructure, and Remote Desktop Services to get access to data which is hosted in the enterprise network. And this is data where data is not actually the app is in the enterprise network and is just screen shared over to the client. So all the data is at rest within the enterprise. Now, another interesting piece of functionality we've introduced in Windows Server 2012 and Windows 8 is the concept of Windows to Go. So Windows to Go is basically where you have a Windows 8 image running on a USB stick. So basically, you take that USB stick and boot from it on any PC, and you've got your enterprise experience which goes along with you wherever you are. So this is a very powerful new piece of functionality we've introduced in Windows 8 and Windows Server 2012. In addition, along with Windows to Go, you can actually make that Windows to Go USB image DirectAccess enabled, which essentially means that from any PC, when you boot up into that Windows to Go image on your USB key, you have access to the corporate network, as well as all the data and settings, including roaming user profiles, folder redirection. All that stuff comes along for free. So you're fully functional and able to work just as you would on your, just like you would at work. And so in Windows Server 2012, we brought all this together in the form of a unified remote access server. In the form of a unified remote access server that encompasses DirectAccess, VPN, and is intended to meet the needs of these heterogeneous client environments. So be it a managed Windows client, be it a tablet, be it an iPad, there are different remote access solutions which fit each one of these needs. And the unified remote access server brings all that together in one single offering. Right. So let's talk a little bit about what unified remote access means in the context of Windows Server 2012. So how many of you have heard about DirectAccess? Let's do that first. OK, significant number. That's great. And how many of you have actually deployed DirectAccess in its Windows Server 2008 R2 form? A fair number. That's great. So you probably understand nuances between a traditional VPN experience and the DirectAccess experience. But I'll go over it for the benefit of the others in the crowd as well. So with VPN, the experience is more of an on-demand experience. So typically, the end user would initiate a connection back to the corporate network and then get access to all the resources in the network. Whereas with DirectAccess, the connection is seamless, and anytime you're connected to the internet, you're connected to the corpnet. So what does that exactly mean, right? What that means is that because of the connectivity mechanism that DirectAccess uses, my IT administrators have visibility into the machines, into these DirectAccess machines, and can patch them and keep them up to date with the policies necessary for being compliant with the restrictions in the organization. So that's kind of the nuances and the difference between a VPN and DirectAccess. And that's where you see the text at the bottom, which says, VPN is used to connect to the network, whereas DirectAccess is extending your network out to encompass all of those clients which are in various locations on the internet. This got a hair trigger on this clicker here. So right. So in terms of the end user experience, you have a great automatic experience with DirectAccess, wherein if we detect an internet connection, we'll automatically get you connected to the corporate network, and the user doesn't really have to think about it. There's no need to initiate a connection. It just happens automatically behind the scenes. And for the IT administrators, they can now see all these clients which are connecting in and patch them and keep them up to date with corporate policies. You've probably heard from IT administrators about how clients hide off the corporate network for extended periods of time and thereby go out of compliance with corporate policies. With DirectAccess, we minimize that compliance failure rate, and by keeping the machine up to date and patched and compliant with the connectivity model that we use. Right. So far we've touched upon kind of the landscape, the evolving work-life landscape, as well as the evolving heterogeneous environment from which devices need to get access to corporate resources. So now let's actually start diving in to the areas that we've made improvements in for Windows Server 2012 remote access. So the first area is the user experience. Everything starts with a great user experience. We have a new integrated client experience in Windows 8, wherein the DirectAccess connection is a first-class citizen in the view available networks UI. So along with all your other Wi-Fi connections and where you would normally go to connect to a network, you would see DirectAccess and the status which goes along with it. We also have new enhanced authentication methods. So in addition to providing authentication just using Windows credentials using Kerberos, we also have improvements in the areas of two-factor auth, where we've got integrated support for one-time passwords, for instance, and also the virtual smart card, which I'll get to in a little more detail as we get through the presentation. And finally, we have a great global experience for our end users. What I mean by that is that for an enterprise which has multiple points of entry into their remote access, multiple remote access entry points spread throughout the world, the end user connecting into the corporate network would connect through the entry point that is closest to them. So it's a great global experience. And we've got a demo coming up which will illustrate this point in great detail in just a little bit. We've also made huge leaps in the area of management, deployment, and monitoring. We now have a unified console which an IT administrator can use to go through all the stages of the life cycle of a deployment, right from the actual deployment itself to ongoing management, health monitoring, and historical reporting. And it's all built in to a single management console. We also have made it possible such that you do not have to make any changes to your existing enterprise networks in order to deploy remote access. And there are a couple of different technologies that we've introduced in Windows Server 2012 that make this possible, which we'll get to in greater detail as well. And as I mentioned, historical reporting and accounting are also built in. We've got some really cool new scenarios that we've introduced, one being off-premise provisioning. Just a little bit about off-premise provisioning. It's the scenario where you've got an unmanaged device, and you can get it fully domain joined, get all the direct access policies on it, and connect back to the enterprise network without ever having to set foot into your corporate network. I'll let that sink in for a little bit, and we'll get to this one in greater detail in the actual slide deck, and I'll discuss how that works. We've got improvements in the hybrid cloud, mainly around the site-to-site area. So we can connect up your private clouds and your public clouds and your on-premise data centers with site-to-site VPNs. And we also have VPN interoperability with mobile devices. So your any third-party VPN clients will interop just fine with our unified remote access server. And finally, we have performance and scale. So we've made a number of improvements in the underlying protocols that we use for connectivity to improve performance and scale. We've also got improvements on how the unified remote access server will work at scale in virtualized environments. And I'll show you some numbers later on in the deck on how we've just blown past our goals in terms of how the unified remote access server scales. So the first area I'm going to deep dive into is the client experience. So the whole idea behind the client experience is that the user really doesn't have to think about it. It's easy, it's automatic, it's natural, right? The idea being that an end user will have the same model of behavior whether they're physically connected to the corporate network or whether they're outside. An example of this is that let's say I'm connected physically to my corporate network, and I get an email with a link to an internal SharePoint site. My natural instinct is I'll click on that link, and bang, the SharePoint site opens up, and I do whatever work I need to do on that site. Now, with our direct access offering, that exact same user experience is possible even when the user is remote and not physically connected to the network. So it's a completely natural extension of how you would work when you're physically in the office is the same way you would work when you're remote. We've also made some improvements to troubleshooting. We have integrated log collection in which the end user, for whatever reason, if there are connectivity issues, which we don't expect, they have the ability to collect logs and send this off to their IT administrators for them to be able to better understand what the underlying problem is and provide remediation steps to the end user. And these logs are completely customizable. So without actually, let's see. I was going to go into a demo. We'll get to that in a minute. So a little more on the integrated client experience. I mentioned multi-site. So multi-site with the client experience, we automatically figure out which is the closest DirectAccess server to you and connect through that. So the end user gets the best quality of connectivity when they're accessing corporate resources. So for instance, I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. We have a pilot in Microsoft right now where we've got multiple entry points all around the world. And typically when I'm at home, I connect up to my Redmond entry point. But when I'm here, the first thing I checked when I was coming over here was, as soon as I landed in Amsterdam, I went to the hotel, checked in, got onto the Wi-Fi network at the hotel, and sure enough, my client was now connected over to an entry point in Israel, which is the next closest one. So smarts are built into the system. It figures out where you need to go and which will provide you the best quality of service without you really having to think about it. Again, it's an integrated experience in that it's all baked into the OS. You no longer have to, for Windows 8 clients, you no longer have to download the DirectAccess Connectivity Assistant. Some of you may be familiar with that. We shipped that as an add-on to Windows 7. We also have a lot of new authentication methods. We use Kerberos for authentication using Windows credentials. We've made this possible through the introduction of a new functionality called the Kerberos proxy, which actually enables the client to get to authenticate to a DC and get the necessary Kerberos credentials to then be able to set up the connectivity channels under the covers. We've also made it such that you don't really need a PKI deployment for basic DirectAccess functionality, thereby removing a big inhibitor that we'd heard from you in the past. We also provide support for various two-factor auth mechanisms like Smart Card, which was already there in R2 and continues to be supported. We also support the virtual Smart Card using the TPM, which is a great user experience in that you no longer have to carry around this physical smart card and worry about your card reader and all this stuff. It's just built into your machine and protected by the TPM. So some great improvements there. And finally, we have a good UX which shows the end user an easy connectivity status as well as any remediation steps they can do to self-remediate. Like, for instance, if the enterprise has deployed two-factor auth and they actually have to provide additional credentials, be it a smart card PIN or a one-time password PIN, then the UX has that affordance to tell the user, hey, you need to do that. You need to put in your PIN to get full access. So do this, click here, and then walk them through the experience from there. In addition to the integration that we've done in the Van UI, we've also introduced a new troubleshooting page for a properties page for DirectAccess. Like I said before, we don't expect users to typically go here unless they have a problem with their connection. It shows you the connection status again, any remediation information. It also gives you information about what site you're connected to and what your connectivity status is for multi-site. So by default, you would just auto-select to the best site. But if you wanted to override it and connect to a particular entry point, primarily for troubleshooting purposes as instructed by your support staff, then you could do that from this page. And finally, we also have easy, customizable log collection, which is possible from this page. So an end user can collect logs and email them off right from here. And the mechanism that is used for log collection is actually customizable by the IT admin. So if we have a rich set of information that we collect in box, but in the event that, in the event that the enterprise admin wants to add some additional information that we did not include in box, they have a way to do that as well and push that out through policy. All right, and so I'm actually going to show you a demo on this client experience and how it works. So quick setup on this. I've got a virtualized environment with a client on the simulated internet with a direct access server named Edge 1 in this case, sitting on the edge of the corporate network, and a resource called App 1 within the corporate network, and I've also got a DC in play. So the client will establish a connection to Edge 1 and then can access the resources within the network. So without further ado, I'm going to go into the demo. So internet is down, so I'm going to resort to my backup plan here, which is a recording of a demo. So what you see in front of you here is a client which is currently not connected to any networks. So just imagine you walked into a coffee shop, and the first thing you do would be go ask them for your Wi-Fi password, go to their portal, put in the password, and then you're connected, right? So that would be the first thing you would do. So before we do that, let me just bring up the WAN UI, the View Available Networks UI, and you see that I'm not connected to any networks right now. The workplace connection, which is my direct access connection, does show up over there, and we'll see how that works. So I'm just going to do a quick PowerShell script to enable my simulated internet, and then go back to the View Available Networks UI. And you see network 2 over there, which is highlighted, got connected. That's my internet connection. And as soon as that happened, the workplace connection started connecting. This is what I was alluding to earlier when I said that there's no end-user interaction needed for this connection to start happening. It's an automatic experience. And there you go. Just like that, within a few seconds, we're connected to the corporate network. All the underlying connectivity and security channels have been established, and we're connected. The disconnect button, which you see over there, can be used in cases where you have name conflicts, for instance, between resources on your local network and resources in your corporate network. But that's more of an advanced user experience that most users won't need to do. I've fired up a browser, and I've accessed App 1. App 1, like I mentioned earlier, is a resource within my corporate network. And notice that I've actually gone to this resource just using the short name. I didn't even have to use the FQDN. It would be exactly the same as how I would have done it if I was connected physically to my corporate network. So the whole idea is it's a natural experience. I can't emphasize that enough. I just do whatever I would normally do when I'm connected to the corporate network. The next thing I'm going to show you is the direct access properties page. To get there, you right-click on the workplace connection and go into properties. Looks like it's glitching. Yeah, there you go. View connection properties, and that brings up the properties page. The properties page, the first part just shows you the current status. In this case, I was connected remotely. I didn't have any remediation that I needed to do. Everything just went through smoothly, and that was great. The second section is where it shows me which site I'm connected through and what site mechanism, selection mechanism I used. In this case, I have 2 sites, one in France and one in Washington, and I'm connected to the one in France. And finally, in the third group down there, we've got the log collection functionality, and where you can view and email logs right from there. I've just brought up an example of the logs that we collect. And as you can see, there's just a ton of information that we collect automatically on behalf of the IT administrator to enable them to be able to troubleshoot their users' connectivity problems. And those pieces of information range from the IPsec policies, that's what we use for securing underlying connections, from the NRPT, which is what we use to do the DNS resolutions, for our transition tunnel technologies like IP, HTTPS, and Teredo, and just a variety of information that the enterprise admin can use to troubleshoot the end user connectivities. And finally, I just wanted to mention one last thing is that the DirectAccess Connectivity Assistant, which we shipped in Windows 7, has been revised and is available for download for Windows 7 clients and incorporates new capabilities for things like one-time password support. So there is a new incarnation of a DCA for Windows 7 clients. All right. So there you saw the integrated client experience. So now I'm going to talk about a new scenario that we've lit up in Windows 8 called off-premise provisioning. So now envision a case where let's say I came to Amsterdam and I lost my laptop or my hard drive crashed or something like that, right? Now I'm in a bit of a soup. Let's say my slides were on there, I don't have them. I'm basically stuck at this point. So how would I get past something like that? One thing I could do is I could go out, presumably buy a consumer machine, and then remotely join that machine to my domain by doing the following. So I call up my help desk or my IT admin, and they can create what is called a provisioning package on my behalf. They then send me that provisioning package through a variety of methods. And once I have that provisioning package, I load that provisioning package onto the client. I reboot, applying that provisioning package. And once I'm done with the reboot, once my machine comes back up, it's fully domain joined. And it has all the direct access policies. And I just log in using my AD creds, my domain credentials, and I'm set, right? So I went from being completely without any form of machine to getting a fully functional enterprise-connected machine without ever having to step into the corporate network. Another extension of this scenario is with Windows to Go. So in a similar concept, just think about maybe if you couldn't go out and buy that laptop that I was talking about earlier, you call up your admin, and he actually ships you a USB stick running the corporate image, and with this, and sends you the provisioning package as well. You apply the provisioning package onto the Windows to Go, onto the Windows to Go OS, and then now on the Windows to Go machine, you have a fully functioning direct access connection. So this is a really exciting new scenario that we've enabled in Windows 8, Windows Server 2012. Yes. Right. So at the moment, we don't have what I would call an in-box solution for automatically creating the provisioning package. But having said that, we do provide the tools necessary for an enterprise to, for instance, create their own portal where they can automate the creation of these provisioning packages. So the idea being is that you would log on to some internet-facing portal, put your creds in, whatever creds are required by that organization, which would then kick off a task to go create that package and pull it down to your machine. But that's not provided in box. I mean, that whole workflow that I described is something that the enterprise would have to put together as it stands today. Yeah, so just a customer code from one of our RDP sessions that we did in Redmond, where Expedia, in this case, was really excited about off-premise provisioning, and they saw a very good use case for things like their kiosk locations to get them managed. So some real great customer validation that we've received on these scenarios as well. Right, so switching gears, let's talk about multi-site. Just give me a second here. So multi-site is essentially the scenario where you've got an enterprise with a global presence, and they need entry points into their corporate network at pretty much geo-distributed. And in those cases, just based on policy, the client will automatically figure out which is the closest entry point and connect through that. Further, so that's the client experience part of multi-site. The other side of it is that the remote access admin, through a single unified console, has visibility into all the entry points in his enterprise, their health status, what various components which make up the unified remote access connection, what the health status of those components is, as well as which users are connecting through which entry points, and not only that, which resources those users are accessing as well. So this is a rich collection of information that is available to the IT admins from a single unified remote access console. So let's talk a little bit about multi-site client-side selection. So I've been harping about the automatic selection for the client. So how does that work? So it's pretty simple, really. The client, when internet connectivity is detected, it sends out the probes to all the direct access servers that it knows about, which are configured through policy. And basically, the first one to respond is the closest. So the least latency is what we pick, and that's the closest one. And we proceed to then set up connectivity and secure that channel to that selected direct access server. So we use a probe-based mechanism to do that. This particular feature for automatic site selection is limited to Windows 8 clients. Windows 7 clients will always get home to a single entry point. An example would be basically for users in, let's say, the Europe region. Let's say we had an enterprise with an American entry point in North America and an entry point in Europe. The Windows 7 Europe users would always connect to the European entry point, and the Windows 7 North America users would always connect through the North America entry point. Whereas Windows 8 clients, if these users are actually roaming across continents, flying to conferences all over the place, then the Windows 8 clients would automatically figure out which one is the closest and connect appropriately. We also support GSLBs for entry point detection. And this is something which you can actually use in conjunction with Windows 7 as well to get the closest entry point selection. Now, one thing I should mention about multi-site, which isn't covered on the slide, is failover as well. So what I mean by that is, let's say I'm in Europe now. I'm connected to an entry point in Europe. And let's say that entry point goes down. The client will automatically figure out that that entry point is down and fail over to the next closest entry point. So it's not just that it's picking the closest one and you're kind of stuck with that. We have an automatic failure detection mechanism built in wherein the client will figure out, hey, this entry point, although it was up at the time I connected to it, it's subsequently gone down, and I need to fail over. And it'll fail over to the next closest entry point. So we do another round of probes, figure out which one's the next closest, and connect to that. So there's also failure detection and failover built in to multi-site. Right. So for multi-site, let's talk a little bit about the configuration and the monitoring flow. So we have the unified remote access console that I was telling you about earlier. So the admin goes into the UX, adds a bunch of entry points. Behind the scenes, we actually use PowerShell. So anything the UX can do, you can do in PowerShell, right? So if all the capabilities in the UX are actually built on top of PowerShell commandlets. And so that's a very powerful story for admins who want to build in automation. You heard some of this in the keynote earlier today in terms of automation using PowerShell. So there is a rich set of commandlets that we've provided for direct access, configuration, monitoring, and reporting. So anyway, so the UX calls into PowerShell. PowerShell, the commandlets then go ahead and author policies in group policy, in group policy objects on your DCs, and they're both server and client GPOs. The server GPOs apply to the appropriate entry point servers. The client GPOs apply to the appropriate clients, be it Win7 or Win8. And that's it, I mean, as far as the configuration goes. Now, for monitoring, the console actually reaches out to these direct access servers, pulls telemetry information from them, like which users are connected, what resources are they accessing, and bubbles that up and represents that in the UI. And again, that monitoring information is also available through PowerShell. Right. So I'm now going to show you a demo on multi-site and high availability. So before we get started, let me just give you a quick setup on the demo environment here. So in this environment, I've got a client on the internet. I've got two enterprise locations, entry points, one in Washington, D.C., and one in Paris. And the Washington, D.C. and the Paris sites are actually connected by a site-to-site tunnel, which is the arrow you see connecting those two circles. The Washington entry point is actually a cluster of two direct access servers in an NLB array. So they're configured for high availability. And the Paris entry point only has a single server. So what I'm going to do is actually have the client connect up through Washington, basically take down the node which it's connected through in that cluster, and then have it fail over to the other node. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing is I open up my View Available Networks UI that you saw earlier and go to the Direct Access Properties page, and it shows that, hey, I'm actually connected through Washington. I basically have it set so that it's manually set to Washington. I then go fire up my browser, go to app 1, similar to what I did before, and it shows me that I've arrived through the Washington entry point. Another thing to note is this IP address that I've been served by the Washington entry point node that I connected through. Notice the 1000 in the IP address there. Just keep an eye on that. It'll become important a little later on in the presentation. And I not only connected to app 1, which was the application server in the Washington site, I also am connected to 2-app1, which is a application server in the France entry point, and I'm getting connectivity to that over the site-to-site tunnel. What I'm going to do now is actually pause the VM which I'm connected through currently, and show that the client actually fails over from the first node in this cluster here to the second node. So while that failover is happening, let's quickly go back to the diagram and recap what we've seen so far. So we had the client connect up to the first node in the Washington entry point, remember the 1000 IP that I showed you earlier, and then you have access to both app1, which is in the Washington entry point, and 2-app1 in the Paris entry point. I then stopped the first node to show the failover occurring. And in this case, when I go back to the actual VM environment, you'll notice that when I access those same resources, you'll see a different IP, and that'll tell us that it's actually connected through the second node in that cluster. I'm then going to actually just connect to France and show you that I can still access both these resources over the site-to-site tunnel, even though I've connected to a completely different entry point at a different site. So let's first see how our failover between the cluster nodes happened. So to do that, fire up the browser again and go to app1. It tells me I've come to the Washington entry point, but notice how my IPs changed. And I can tell that this is the second node in the cluster because the second node is what is serving out these IPs with the 1001 in them for the purposes of this demo. And again, I have not only access to app1, I also have access to 2-app1. Right. I'm going to fire up my DA properties page, and I'll switch over to France. In a real-world scenario, this is just my simulated environment, so I don't have the opportunity to show you the actual failover. But for purposes of this demo, I'm just going to pick France and show you that we still have connectivity and access to all the resources, regardless of which entry point you came through, right? So that's the whole idea there. So pick France. And bring up the browser. Just a minute. And this time it tells me I've come through the France entry point. So that's multi-sided work, essentially. We've got access to resources in both sites, regardless of which entry point you came through. And the client will automatically figure out which one is the closest to you. And for the purposes of troubleshooting, or just like I did in this demo, the end user has the ability to kind of hardwire themselves to an entry point for a variety of reasons. So that is multi-site. And another customer quote from concurrency. They're extremely excited about the multi-site capability and how it really brings to bear the ability for DirectAccess to be deployed at scale for a large enterprise which has a global presence. Right, so let's take a minute to just kind of recap what we've seen so far. We saw the integrated client experience, how we baked in the connectivity status, remediation, and troubleshooting right into the view available networks UI in Windows 8. We also have improvements to the DirectAccess Connectivity Assistant for Windows 7. We saw multi-site and high availability, the ability for clients to automatically connect through the closest entry point, the ability to fail over between nodes in a clustered entry point, as well as fail over across entry points. So now I'm going to switch and start talking to you about some of the server-side stuff we've done. And there is a lot of really cool functionality we put in on the server side as well. We touched on a couple of aspects, but we'll drill into them a little more now. So in Windows Server 2012, we've made it really easy to deploy DirectAccess. And we made it such that you can stand up a DirectAccess deployment in literally a matter of minutes with just a few clicks. And so the idea being is that we want to reduce the barrier for entry for people to be able to participate in DirectAccess deployments, be it going all the way from like a spectrum of just a lab deployment to see what this technology does and how it works, all the way up to up to a full production deployment, including multi-site, high availability, throw in OTP, and whatever else. So across that whole spectrum. We have a new Express Wizard, which an IT generalist can use to just get the deployment up and running in just a matter of minutes. And finally, and this is something to kind of internalize, is that it is a unified remote access role. And so it's not just about direct access, although that is the premier offering. There is a VPN aspect to this as well. And again, I'll relate this back to what we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, is that direct access, while really cool and is a great end-user experience, it doesn't necessarily meet all the needs in terms of non-managed clients and non-Windows clients, for that matter. So there is a place for VPN as well in this story. So let's dive right into our easy server setup demo. And basically what I'm going to show you in this demo is the Express Wizard. And so let's get this rolling. Right. So in this one, we're going to concentrate on the Express Wizard and giving the IT admin the capability to just stand up a direct access deployment without really having to think about it. What you see in front of you here is the remote access management console. So what I'm going to do is hit run the Getting Started wizard, which launches the Express configuration. And the first page that is presented to you is ask the IT admin, hey, do you want to deploy direct access and VPN? Do you want to just do direct access, or do you want to do both? And we recommend doing both. Again, going back to some of the points I hit upon earlier, if the enterprise has a need to serve heterogeneous client environments, then deploying both direct access and VPN is the right thing. But then again, depending on the client, the type of client environments they have, they may choose to only do direct access if they only have Windows 8 clients, for instance. But these options are there, and the recommended one is direct access and VPN. So hang on a minute. Oh, there it goes. OK. So for the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to click on Deploy Direct Access Only. And at this point, the system is going through a variety of checks. It figures out what topology, what network topology the direct access server is in. It also checks for things like permissions in Active Directory, and comes up with a page which is based on smart defaults, based on what it's figured out when it was doing its checks. And on this page, the admin actually has the ability to choose 2 new deployment topologies that we've introduced in Server 2012. So we've introduced the behind the edge device. So you can deploy the direct access server behind a firewall or a NAT in your DMZ. Excuse me. You can also deploy the direct access server with just a single network adapter. OK, so I hit finish, and that's it. I'm pretty much done. I literally did not have to do any input. The system was smart enough to figure everything out for me, and with literally a few clicks, and I don't know, what was it, like maybe a minute and a half, I have my direct access server fully configured, ready to go. All I need to do is get the policies, do a group policy update on my client, and I'll be good to go. So this allows an IT admin to stand up a basic direct access deployment with little effort. So we're really proud of that. All right. There you go. Another customer quote from our RDP program. Direct access is brain dead easy to install. And you can see where this code was coming from. It was right off of the Express Wizard deployment. And Bear Creek School is kind of interesting. They're a school in the Redmond area who we've been using as our small-scale deployment TAP customer. And the principal of the school actually set this up over the weekend. And they're not like an IT administrator by any means, and they were able to get through it. So we've made it such that DirectAccess now has a much broader reach, not just to large-scale enterprises with IT specialists on staff, but is also applicable to medium and small businesses with just IT specialists, with just IT generalists on staff. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Right. So how do we do this? How do we make the deployment so easy? The first thing we did is we removed the need for PKI. So we used Kerberos proxy as a mechanism for the client to get to the DCs, authenticate the DCs, and pull down the Kerberos tickets, which then would be used in the IPsec authentication. The wizard actually creates self-signed certs on the server side. There are no client-side cert requirements at all. We also simplified the IPsec configuration under the covers. So gone are the two-tunnel architectures that some of you may be familiar with. With the Express Wizard, you just have a single IPsec tunnel which encompasses the entire range of your CorpNet IP address range. And so with that, there's no longer the need to manage the IP address list in your first tunnel. The example of why this was a problem in the Windows Server 2008 R2 timeframe is the first tunnel had things like DNS servers, DCs, HRAs, and just management servers in that tunnel. And quite frequently, what happens in enterprises is that these DCs come and go. IP addresses change. And so the first tunnel would constantly get out of sync, if you will. And so there had to be an ongoing management of that tunnel. By just collapsing it down to be for the tunnel to encompass the entire corporate IPv6 range, we got rid of the need for this management activity. And the Express Wizard, the configuration it spits out, does use single-factor auth. So it's just using your domain creds for authentication. Now, so with the Express Wizard, we're looking at a simple deployment, which you don't have complicated things like two-factor auth to worry about, for instance. We do still support advanced configurations, much like what was already present in Server 2008 R2. We fully support PKI and can use machine certificates for the authentication. It still uses a double tunnel configuration with the first tunnel using describing the DNS, DCs, and other management servers. We have provided a new PowerShell commandlet focused on solving the tunnel management problem I talked about earlier. So that PowerShell will essentially get the first tunnel IP addresses in sync, and it's something which any IT admin can very easily do. So we've solved that problem, made it much easier to manage the double tunnel configuration. And there are a variety of different authentications that are supported as part of the advanced config. So you can use single factor just using domain creds, two factor using a variety of different mechanisms like smart card, one-time passwords, or the virtual smart card itself. And yes, we have multi-site deployments, which I spoke to you about earlier as well. and we support Windows 8 and Windows 7 clients. I'll actually come back to this point at the end to talk about kind of an interoperability matrix, if you will, on how Windows 7 works with R2 and how Windows 7 works with R2 and Windows Server 2012, and how Windows 8 works with R2 and Server 2012, and what the differences in capabilities are. So we'll get back to that in a little bit. All right, so let's start. This is one of my favorite slides, actually. No IPv6 required. Now, there's probably a common misconception with DirectAccess is that, hey, I have to have IPv6 for this to work. And let me just tell you straight up, that you do not need IPv6 in your corporate network. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to make any changes to your corporate network. With Windows Server 2012, we've made it such that you just drop the DirectAccess server in, and we'll figure the rest out for you in terms of the translations needed between v6 and v4. We do use v6. It's not to say that we don't use v6. We do use v6 specifically to deal with situations like name conflicts, like where you've got networks which are using the same set of private addresses. Like take your home network, for instance, and a corporate network. There are going to be cases where they're using the same address range, like a 192.168 range. And so how do you disambiguate resources in these two networks? And that's where IPv6 comes into play, and that's why we use it primarily. But having said that, we do not require IPv6. On the client side, if we have native, if the client can get a native IPv6 address, it'll use that to contact the DirectAccess server. And this is still kind of in its infancy. There are geographies where ISPs are providing IPv6, but not super prevalent throughout the world, but it is there. If IPv6 is not available, then the clients will use transition tunnel technologies to tunnel traffic over v4, either UDP or SSL. The technologies in play are called Teredo and IP HTTPS to get the traffic to the DirectAccess server. Once you get to the DirectAccess server, let's say your enterprise network is v4 only, we have new functionality built into Windows Server 2012 where we abstract away the client connecting over v6, and we basically translate the v6 to v4 using a couple of different pieces, components, namely the DNS64 and the NAT64. And so your internal corporate network can be IPv4 only, and the DirectAccess server will do that translation back and forth between v6 and v4 and vice versa. So again, the takeaway from this is no IPv6 required on your corporate network. Right. We've also made huge improvements in the ongoing management for DirectAccess and unified remote access, actually. So deployment is the first step. There's always going to be tasks associated with making sure that your deployments are working as expected, they're healthy, and you want to know what's going on with them, like who's connecting in, how long have they been connected in for, what resources are they accessing, how much bandwidth are they using, and all those kinds of pieces of information are available through the remote access console as well as through PowerShell itself. I'm running a little short on time, so I'm not going to be able to show you a demo for this, but do come and see me either after this session, or you can come to the TLC. We've got a booth there, and I'll be happy to walk you through some of these monitoring and reporting functionalities. Right. PowerShell. You heard it in the keynote, and we'll say it again. We've made a lot of improvements in our PowerShell story, and we've created this rich system of commandlets which allows you to manage, monitor all aspects of your remote access deployment. So anything you can do in the UI, you can do through PowerShell. And in fact, I missed showing you one thing when I was doing the demo earlier, which is where when we went through the easy server setup, you can actually export the PowerShell script that it's using behind the scenes right from that window as well. So for enterprise admins who are curious about, hey, what is this actually doing in terms of, and how do I map what the UX is doing down to PowerShell, we have an affordance for that to get admins started off with that experience. Right. Performance and scale. So with improvements we've made in Server 2012, one of the things that we realized is that to be able to be a competitive offering for enterprises, for large-scale enterprises, especially with global deployments, we need to be able to scale up and scale out effectively and with minimal infrastructure cost to the enterprise. We already talked about high availability, so I'm going to skip that for the time being, but let's just talk about performance. So if you take a look at this simple graph over here, we have preliminary numbers which we between comparing Windows Server 2008 R2 and Server 2012, and these tests were run on a 4-core, 2.1 gig CPU with 4 gig of RAM, and the throughput that we're seeing is double what was capable in Server 2008 R2. And so that's just amazing. And how have we done this? We did this with a variety of different improvements. For instance, in Server 2008 R2, we did not have support for RSS, receive side scaling, for UDP. So when clients are connecting over Teredo, which uses UDP, the traffic was always pegging one core, if you had a 4-core CPU in this case, and traffic wasn't getting distributed evenly. With Server 2008, for Server 2012, we now have full support for RSS and UDP, and as you can see in this graph here, the characteristics of load are spread evenly across all the cores. We've also made a number of improvements to IP-HTTPS, which is one of our connectivity protocols, to make it really competitive with Teredo. So one of the things we did is we removed the need for double encryption. So IP-HTTPS essentially uses an SSL channel, but in DirectAccess, we use IPsec as our security mechanism. So the traffic is already being encrypted by IPsec, so we don't see a need, there is no need, to encrypt using SSL. So we got rid of one layer of encryption. The other thing is SRIOV, which is single root IO virtualization, which essentially exposes capabilities of the host NIC to VMs and allows the VMs to take full advantage of the host NIC. And basically what this means is that now you get much comparable performance in VMs as opposed to just bare metal. We've also made a number of improvements to end-to-end security. So we have support for IPsec task offload within a VM. With R2, that was only available on the physical host itself. But with the virtualization improvements we've made, you can now task offload within a VM. And you can also configure NIC teaming such that you can fail over between two NICs. If one NIC fails, then you can fail over to another NIC. And you can also have aggregation of traffic across multiple NICs. Okay, so connectivity to the hybrid cloud. So in the current state, what we've got is clients on the internet connecting over to resources in private and public clouds, and each of these are serviced by dedicated infrastructure. So you've got gateway devices, if you will, connecting, which client's connecting to in the private and public cloud. You also have separate infrastructure which is used to connect the clouds themselves. With Server 2012, what we've essentially done is we've converged this infrastructure such that you can now have DA, VPN, and site-to-site VPN all on the same hardware. So we've essentially made it such that you can consolidate hardware and make better use of your infrastructure, thereby driving down capital expense, essentially. And just to reiterate a couple of points, DirectAccess would be used for the managed Windows clients. VPN would be for non-managed and non-Windows clients. And cross-premise is the site-to-site VPN, which I was talking about, would essentially connects the private and public clouds. So the interoperability matrix, this is the one I was referring to earlier. I'm going to kind of breeze through this as we get running a little short on time. But so Windows 8, Windows Server 2012, all features are fully supported, right? That's the latest wave of the offering that we have. With Windows 7, we have some limitations. Windows 7 does require the deployment of PKI infrastructure for Windows 7 clients to be able to talk to Windows Server 2012. Windows 7 clients can't or don't have the capability to do automatic site selection. We talked about that earlier. And we don't have off-premise provisioning of Windows to go with Windows 7. When we talk about Windows 8 clients going against Windows Server 2008 R2 server, they're supported, but you can't have DirectAccess and VPN on a single server. Further, we don't have the DNS64, NAT64 built into Server 2008 R2. We do require PKI, and there's no capability for multi-site. So those are new features for Windows Server 2012 R2. So we don't have that in, 2012. So we don't have it in R2. And finally, for Windows 7 and Server 2008 R2, yeah, there's no multi-site, no off-premise provisioning. There's no DNS64, NAT64. So you get the idea. Finally, we've worked with a number of partners in the industry, ranging from appliance partners to load balancer partners and security vendors to come up with a variety of solutions. And Appliance is one of our, and IVO are a couple of our partners who are working on the appliances for unified remote access. We've partnered with F5 on coming up with a white paper which describes the integration of DirectAccess with an F5 in a load-balanced configuration. And we worked with Gemalto on a two-factor authentication story using one-time passwords. And that's it. So let me take a minute to summarize before I throw it open for questions. We touched upon the great user experience integrated into Windows 8. We talked about deployment, ease of deployment, and monitoring, enabling new scenarios like hybrid cloud connectivity and off-premise provisioning, and scale and performance, both in virtualized and on bare metal. And so the call to action for you guys here is start deploying DA now. We've already got a number of TAP customers who are deployed in production using the RP builds, and they're absolutely loving it. So please go out and try this out for yourselves. As you can see, we've made a ton of improvements to the experience in Windows 8 and Server 2012. So please try it out. Thank you. And just one last thing, like I mentioned, feel free to come and see us in the Technical Learning Center. We have a booth for DirectAccess, and I'll be happy to give you more demos and talk to you about any questions. Thank you very much.